so good to be here with you this morning. My name is Nick. I'm the senior pastor here at Canyon Springs, and if you're joining us online, it's so great to have you with us also. Please introduce yourself if you haven't yet. I saw some people were introducing themselves online, and that's awesome. But we're thankful that you're joining us. It's so good to be here with you, and we're continuing our series on the book of Esther, which we're calling For Such a Time as This. And last week we were introduced to a Persian king by the name of Xerxes, who actually ends up deposing his queen, kind of firing his queen Vashti because she refuses to come when he summons her to come to this party with him and his friends. And then he realizes, I should not have done that. Now I don't have a queen anymore. And so there's this kind of twisted form of a beauty pageant kind of thing. And there's this Jewish girl, Esther, who ends up becoming queen. And Esther is an orphan who has been raised by her older cousin, Mordecai. And when we left the story last week, Esther's queen, Mordecai, is he's doing his thing, and he actually ends up uncovering a plot to assassinate the king, and ends up reporting that, and that's kind of where we left it last week. But here's the main point of the book of Esther that we introduced last week, and that's that God works behind the scenes through both our life experiences and our current situation to accomplish His good plan. We also noted last week that God is never mentioned by name in the entire book of Esther, which is interesting, even an entire book of the Bible where God is never mentioned by name. How weird is that? And what we see is that the story was written like this on purpose. It was written like this because we as the readers we're challenged to watch for God as we are reading this book, and we're supposed to kind of watch for God to show up in the story even though He isn't mentioned. And as we read the story, we see evidence of God working even though He's not specifically named. And the story of Esther is full of these interesting coincidences that aren't really coincidences because it's actually God showing up. And even though God isn't mentioned, He definitely shows up in this story. That's what we see. God is very, very active in the book of Esther, just like He's very active in our world and in our lives. Even if we don't acknowledge that He's working, He's still working. And so this week we're going to see that God uses Esther in her position to become an advocate for her people. To become an advocate. And the path for Esther to become queen of Persia has been full of pain and trauma. God is able, though, to use her position as queen to transform her into an advocate for her people. And this is really significant for those of us who are believers, those of us who are followers of Jesus. I know not everybody here is, but those of us who are, the gospel message, the good news is that Jesus Christ gave His life on the cross for us. That's for all people to hear, that good news. He gave His life on the cross so that we could be forgiven of sin. Jesus is our advocate before God the Father. He spoke for us. He advocated for us when we could not speak for ourselves, when we could not do anything for ourselves. We are saved for a purpose. When we put our trust in Jesus, we're saved for a purpose. And part of that purpose is to be an advocate. God calls all of us to be advocates. He calls all of us to speak up for those who can't speak for ourselves. And Esther is an example of this for us. Now, all throughout Scripture, there's this call to advocacy. I'm just going to give you one example. Psalm 82. This is God speaking to some people, and He says, "How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked." And as we're going to see, Mordecai challenges Esther to be an advocate for her people the same way that Psalm 82 challenges us to be advocates, defenders, deliverers. So let's jump into the story for today. We're going to be starting out in Esther chapter 3, and there has been a 4-year time gap between chapters 2 and chapters 3. There's actually a 4-year time gap between chapters 1 and 2. There's 4 years in there. There's also 4 years in between 2 and 3. And we're going to divide our story into 3 acts today. The first act is an old enemy with a new name. So look at Esther chapter 3. It says, "After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than all that of the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. The royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th month of the year, or the 12th year of the King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and a month, and the lot fell in the 12th month, the month of Adar. All right, so what we see is the king promotes this guy named Haman to be the highest office in the land, and you get the idea that nobody really likes this guy, but the king has to kind of command that people will bow down to him. And so why doesn't Mordecai bow down to Haman? Well, Jews, we see in Scripture, they're not opposed to bowing down to people to show honor of their position. So it's not that. He could have honored Haman's position even though he didn't really like the guy. But in this case, there's something else going on. And we find out that Haman is an Agagite, which means he was part of an ethnic group called the Amalekites. And the Persian Empire was this huge empire at this point that ruled over all these different people groups. And one of those people groups was the Israelites, the Jews, and another one of those people groups was the Amalekites. And so the Jewish people, the Israelites, they have this ancient kind of rivalry, I guess, or the Jews and the Amalekites are ancient enemies. And the rivalry goes all the way back to when Moses led the Israelites out of captivity in Egypt, which was 1,000 years before the time of Esther. And this is what Exodus chapter 17 says. Moses said, "Because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation." So that's 1,000 years before this time of Esther that was written. Another 400 years after the time of Moses, there was a king of Israel by the name of King Saul. He was Israel's first king. And he went to war with the Amalekites, and God said, "Hey, I want you to wipe the Amalekites out. I just want you to deal with these people." And Saul was disobedient to God's command. He didn't carry it out completely. And so as a result, the Amalekites continued to be a threat to God's people, the Jews, all the way down to the time of Esther. Haman is an Amalekite, and now he's plotting to completely destroy the Jews. You can see the issue here. And so Mordecai doesn't bow to Haman, not because he doesn't respect the position, but because he knows what Haman represents. He represents a threat to the plan that God is working out through his people, the Jews. God's plan was to bring about the salvation of the world through the Jewish people, and we see that God fulfilled that. He did that, despite all the efforts through all the years of people to try to destroy the Jews. And we see that Haman cast this lot, which is kind of like a dice, basically a random way to choose something. And so he cast this lot and to choose a date for killing all the Jews. One of the purposes of the book of Esther is to explain where the Jewish holiday of Purim came from. And Purim means Feast of Lots, which really kind of means Feast of Random Chance, right? And so it's called that because Haman uses lots to choose this date. Really, this could be called the Feast of Random Chance. And now all the events in the book of Esther are going to be counting down to this day, this 13th day in the month of Adar, which is about a year away from when Haman cast the lot. And we know nothing in the book of Esther is random, though, right? So everything's leading to this date, and Haman thinks his plan is going to unfold one way, but God is working out a completely different plan. And so really, this feast could be better called the Feast of God working behind the scenes, because that's really what it is, right? And every year on the Feast of Purim, the book of Esther is read publicly in the synagogue. This still happens to this day. And whenever the reader mentions Haman's name, everyone boos and hisses and stamps their feet, and they say, "May his name be blotted out." Okay, that's kind of it's kind of this interactive story time. And to the Jews everywhere, Haman represents everybody who has ever tried to exterminate the people of Israel. And this is what Mordecai sees when he sees Haman. He sees that history. And here's an interesting little fact. There are 12 tribes of Israel. King Saul was of the tribe called Benjamin. And we saw that King Saul did not accomplish what God called him to do with the Amalekites. But Mordecai was also from the tribe of Benjamin as well. Just a little interesting fact for you. But because Mordecai won't bow, now Haman decides to wipe all the Jews out, which is interesting, right? Look at verse 8. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws, and it's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury. So the king took his signet ring from his finger, gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, an enemy of the Jews. He said, keep your money, the king said to Haman, and do with the people as you please. Now notice that Haman purposely doesn't mention exactly who this people group is. He keeps it general. They're just a threatening group. That's all they are. So it makes them sound very shady. And then Haman offers this ridiculous amount of money, 10,000 talents of silver. Herodotus, who's the Greek historian, he tells us the entire annual income of the Persian Empire was about 15,000 talents. So Haman is offering 2/3 of that amount, 2/3 of the total annual income of the Persian Empire. And obviously Haman was very wealthy. He also had this plan to loot the Jews as they were killed so he could pay back some of this. But it looks like the king is refusing the money from Haman. He's not actually. That's customary in that time and place to refuse the first offer so that somebody can insist. It was just a way that people did business. So make no mistake, the king is planning on accepting this money. He would be silly to not accept that money. But the king gives his signet ring to Haman, which granted him the authority to act on, like basically as the king, like with the king's authority. He could write any document he wants, and he can seal it, and it's as if the king himself sent it. It was law, and it had to be obeyed. And so it was a foolish thing for King Xerxes to just hand his ring over. But as we've seen, this king is kind of known for making decisions and then regretting them later. That's kind of a theme throughout Esther. But if you look at verse 13, you can see Haman's plan starting to unfold. It says, dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. That's the capital of Persia. And so the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. The actual Hebrew there is thrown into chaos. Bewildered is maybe not quite a strong enough translation there, but what we have here, it's so interesting, is this chapter ending with the king and Haman sitting down to have a drink together while this genocidal edict goes out into all the kingdom and the capital city is just in chaos. It's a really disturbing image. And that brings us to Act 2, which is Mordecai laments. Mordecai laments. Chapter 4, jumping into chapter 4 here. When Mordecai, that's Esther's cousin, learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress, and she sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. Okay, what we see here is the practice of mourning, also called lament. And the Jewish people are expressing their great emotion and their sadness and their anger about this edict. And so Mordecai goes into the city mourning and lamenting loudly. And really this is an act of protest, is what it is. Because Mordecai, he was neither afraid to admit who he was. I mean, he wasn't ashamed to let people know where he stood. He's already told the people at the gate that he's a Jew. Now he's telling the whole city that he's not only a Jew, but he opposes this edict that has gone out from the king. And it's significant that as he's going through the city and as he's wailing and protesting, he has to stop his lament protest at the king's gate. He can't go in, because kings of that day lived in an artificial paradise that sheltered them from the realities of life. They don't want to hear lament. They don't want to know how their decisions and their actions might be affecting people who aren't in power. Like, they don't want to know that. George H. Morrison was a famous Scottish preacher who lived in the early 1900s. He said this: "No sackcloth must come within their gates. They must have a good time at any cost. They must live their easy and comfortable lives as if there were no voices calling them." And now I have to ask the question, has anything really changed? Has anything really changed at all? And I have to ask, does this attitude from those in power, does this attitude reflect the heart of God? Because we've already seen that God doesn't separate himself from us. Instead, he draws near to us in Jesus. He became our advocate in Jesus. God turns his ear to hear the mourning and the lament of his people, and really of all people who are oppressed. And God invites us to bring our burdens to him, whatever it is. God challenges us to be advocates the way that he is. He calls all of us to be advocates, to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. Now, ponder that. Think about that. We're going to come back to that here in a minute. But even though Mordecai can't take his lament into the palace, he still gets the attention of Esther, which is what he wanted. And so he refuses this clothing that she tries to send to him. He refuses to be comforted. And so that sets up this famous conversation that happens in Esther chapter 4, which also is Act 3. Esther is queen for such a time as this. And we need to remember that this whole conversation is happening through a messenger. Right? It's not happening in person because of the situation. Look at verse 6. "So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people." He wants her to go to the king and fix this. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." So Mordecai wants Esther to step into her role of advocate for her people. She has this opportunity to use her position to make a difference, to save thousands and thousands of lives. And Esther lets Mordecai know that by law, she can assume that she will be put to death if she goes to the king without being summoned. I mean, that's the assumption. The exception would be that her life is spared. All right, so Mordecai replies to Esther, and these are probably some of the most famous verses in the whole book. Verse 12. "When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: 'Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this.'" Now there's so much that's amazing about what Mordecai says here. Once again, God's not specifically mentioned, right? And Mordecai, he's showing an amazing amount of faith here, though, even though God isn't mentioned. If Esther doesn't step into her role as advocate, God will still save his people. He has to save them. They are the people of the promise. That has to happen. So here's what Mordecai is saying to Esther and to us as well. Being an advocate could cost you, but not being an advocate also has a cost. Right? And if you see an injustice being done and you don't address it, if you see someone in pain and you don't help them, if you don't give voice to those who can't speak for themselves, now you might avoid the personal cost, that whatever that would cost you to do something and to help, but there is still a cost. Is Mordecai saying that God is going to bring judgment on Esther? Is he saying that, hey, God will save the Jews but not spare her? Maybe. Maybe that's what he's saying. He might also be saying that if Esther doesn't use her position to help the Jews, she is disavowing her family and her heritage. She will be sacrificing her Jewishness in that moment. And so what's the correlation for us? If we don't advocate when we can, when we compromise, it's not like God's hands are tied. right? Like, God can still work without us, but we lose a part of our humanity when we don't join God in what He's doing. There's always a cost. There's a cost to stepping out, and there's a cost to not stepping out. So what's Esther going to do? Well, her reply to Mordecai is just as famous as Mordecai's challenge. Verse 15, then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do, and when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instruction. So Esther accepts the role as advocate. And I mean, isn't it a beautiful thing? Like her faith, her resolve, she accepts that she could die. She doesn't assume that God is going to protect her from the consequences just because she's doing His will. And that's a common misconception. Doing God's will doesn't mean God protects us from all the costs and consequences. And so she tells Mordecai, gather everyone and have them fast. She doesn't say have them pray, she says have them fast. The prayer is kind of assumed in there, but Esther is going to have her attendants do the same thing. Esther is going to have the support of all these people when she goes to the king. She's going to have the support of the Lord. Don't forget, when she goes, she doesn't go alone. And I love Esther's words. I will go to the king even though it's against the law. Remember, it was Queen Vashti who first showed that a queen could defy the rules of the king under certain circumstances. And everyone knows what happened to Vashti, right? Something worse could happen, the same thing or something worse could happen to Esther. So this idea of violating laws that are unjust and then dealing with the consequences, it reminds me of the civil rights activists who stood up in the Jim Crow South. They would deliberately break laws that were unjust, and then they would just accept the consequences. They would not resist arrest. They would go quietly to jail. They weren't trying to overturn all laws. They were trying to appeal to a higher law. They were trying to point out the injustice of certain laws when compared to this higher law. So it's a violation of the law for Esther to appear before the king without being summoned. That is technically against the law. But isn't it a greater violation of a higher law to issue an edict to kill thousands of innocent people? Esther shows us what it looks like to be an advocate. God calls all of us to be advocates, to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. And Esther is an example of this. It's an amazing moment. We're just going to kind of sit in this moment for a week because we don't find out what happens in the story until next week. I mean, of course, you can read ahead and you can find out. But God is calling each of us to be an advocate. So let's get specific. What does this look like for us? I want to talk about 2 obstacles to being an advocate that we can face in our lives. And we see these obstacles in Esther's story as well. Here's the first obstacle. That is the trap of trauma. Trap of trauma. Esther had trauma in her history, trauma in her present. Her parents had died. She had to be raised by a family member. She was pulled into this awful situation where she was basically had concubine status until she was given the status as queen. And now she still had some fear for her life. Obviously, her life could be taken at any moment. She's trying to keep her nationality a secret because it's dangerous for people to know who she really is. So Esther had some trauma in her story. I think we can agree on that. And many of us have trauma in our story as well. All right, some of it is self-inflicted. Some of it has been inflicted on us by other people. It was out of our control. But even if you don't have trauma in your story, we have the collective trauma of living through the last couple years with the global pandemic and the unrest that we've seen. And so what trauma does is it traps us in place. We can't be the advocate that God would have us be. We can't be empathetic because we're so focused on our own pain. We can't speak for those who are suffering and oppressed because we are in that place of being trapped. And there was some amount of this happening in Esther's life as well. She was trapped. And we have to admit that Esther was traumatized. Some of her reluctance to go to the king might be because of this. She has her own pain to deal with. In order for us to be good advocates, we have to do the work of working through our trauma. When you're on an airplane and they're doing the little safety thing at the beginning that they do, what do they tell you about the oxygen masks? They say put your own oxygen mask on first before you help somebody else with theirs, because you're no good to anybody when you're passed out, right? And so put your own oxygen mask on. Well, how do you do that? We'll talk about that more in a minute. But first, I want to give you the second obstacle, which is the cocoon of comfort and privilege. Now, I realize the word privilege is kind of a loaded word these days, so let me define what I mean by privilege. Privilege is having the option to not engage with the stories of others. And this is where Esther was. She lived in the palace for a while. Now she is disconnected from the plight of her people. Esther didn't have a lot of power in her position. We see she could be killed at any moment, but she did have privilege. All right? Mordecai has to kind of jar Esther out of this privilege that she's lived in for some time, because he has to remind her that not taking action could also cost her. We face the same obstacle. Right? We have the option to ignore the plight of those who are suffering, those who are struggling, because we don't cross paths with them. Out of sight, out of mind. This isn't a lack of compassion as much as it's a lack of awareness. There's people who don't have access to food or health care. There's those who can't get a fair trial. There's those who don't know where they're going to sleep tonight. There's those who deal with prejudice and bias. How often do we encounter people who are struggling? Because of comfort and privilege, we don't have to encounter them a lot of times if we don't want to. And if we don't encounter them, how can we advocate for them? So how do we overcome these obstacles? Well, interestingly, the way to overcome both these obstacles is actually the same thing, and it's lament. The way to overcome them is lament. Lament is this passionate expression of grief or sorrow, and here's what lament does. Lament allows us to give up hope of a better past, and lament connects us with the suffering of others. It allows us to give up hope of a better past, and it connects us with the suffering of others. If we are dealing with trauma, if we have pain in our past that we haven't addressed, the way we can address those things is by admitting that they happened and by grieving them. Right? We can't run from those feelings that we have, the issues. Those feelings are going to come out somewhere. They always do. And the way to deal with those emotions is to lament. Lament allows us to give up hope of a better past by grieving those losses and by moving forward. And a trusted friend can help us with this. They can help us lament through our trauma. Sometimes we might need to go to a trained therapist for that, and if that's the case, that's okay. My encouragement to you is to start doing the work. God is calling you to be an advocate for others, and He can use your story, but first you have to put your own oxygen mask on. And a great first step is to go to Celebrate Recovery on Thursday nights here at Canyon Springs. 6 p.m. they do dinner. 7 p.m. is when a large group starts for CR. It's an amazing first step because all you have to do is show up. Just show up. Lament also connects us with the suffering of others. And this is why people who are in power and privilege, who have power and who have privilege, they don't like lament. They find it uncomfortable. They find it threatening. Remember, no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter the king's gate. Now, maybe we can't fix the injustices of our culture because we haven't mourned the injustices of the past. Maybe instead of spending so much time defending ourselves, we should spend time lamenting the things that aren't as they should be. As we close today, I just want to remind you this, that God calls all of us to be advocates. He calls all of us to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves, and Esther is an example of this for us. Lament is the path to becoming an advocate. It was lament that got Esther's attention. It was lament that helped her see past her own trauma to see the plight of her people. But here's the rub. In our culture, we're really bad at lament. We need to get better. We need more practice to learn how to lament well. But that's exactly what God is calling us to do. And so here's some questions for you to reflect on. And if any of these resonate with you, I encourage you can write them down. You can actually find these questions in the sermon notes section of the app. And you can reflect on these this week. Take some time to reflect on them. But what do you need to lament personally? What trauma needs to be surfaced and dealt with in a purposeful way? And then what do you need to lament? What do you need to lament culturally? What suffering do you need to connect with? Where do you need to extend empathy to someone who is hurting? What do we need to lament? Jesus became our advocate. And God is calling us to advocate for others. So let's get to work. Let's pray. God, I thank you for the amazing story of Esther and Mordecai and how God, it seems like even though you're not mentioned by name, it seems like they were turning to you and that they were trusting you to sustain them. God, we're in the same place where we've got things in our own lives that we need to deal with. We've got things in our community, challenges in our community that we need to deal with. We've got challenges in our country and in our world. What we need, God, is for you to empower us. Help us, give us your eyes to see those things that you see, those things that break your heart. Help us to grieve the things in our own lives that we need to give over to you and move on from, and also help us to grieve the things in our culture that need to be addressed. Form us into the advocates that you would have us be. We pray these things in your name. Amen.